A little bit on soil health assessment today. Soil health assessment is basically going out and determining what the status of that soil health is. One way to put it is you're taking your soil to the doctor. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One is by going out and visually assessing your soil. Another is by going and taking a soil sample and sending it to a lab and getting a soil health assessment back. And I'll talk a little bit about both of those. I'm going to bring back this example that I gave yesterday because it was one of my first encounters with really looking at standard soil testing on two farms that were exactly the same soil type and seeing that stark a difference. Standard soil tests tend to give you organic matter if you're lucky, and then nutrients and pH. And that is what we have been testing for many decades. And so in this particular case, we had this specialty crop grower who was growing strawberries and then couldn't anymore, and then tried sweet corn, and gosh, that wasn't working out either. And then we had this mixed organic operation with animals and grain crops and vegetable crops all in rotation. And the standard soil test actually said that this soil, the one on the right, was better off because its nutrients had been carefully managed, right? That farmer had been doing soil samples and getting their assessment that said, gosh, you need to add more phosphorus, you need to add some lime. And they were doing that because that's the information they had access to. So they were very carefully managing the chemical functioning of their soil, the ability of that soil to provide the nutrients in available form to their crops. But they had completely neglected the biological and physical function of the soil because at the time there was no soil health assessment available through a lab. It has only been over the last 20 years or so when I started at Cornell and developed the Cornell Soil Health Assessment with that big team. That was the first publicly available soil health assessment that got put out there for use by growers. Before that, soil health was mostly called soil quality and was mostly in the research world. And so researchers had known for a long time that there were issues, and organic farmers and a whole lot of the other sort of fringe various different certifications, biodynamic and whatnot, right? They were more aware that, hey, there's this ecological side to farming, and they were managing that side. But standard conventional agriculture, there was chemical soil testing, right? And so here was one of those stark examples side by side, and we see those kinds of examples across everywhere. I think pretty much globally, there are examples of same soil type, different management, you get a huge difference in function. So how do we assess that? We talked about this downward spiral. I'm not going to go back through. Once you're at the bottom of that of that spiral, once you've lost that function, how do you tell what's wrong, right? Like if you think about going to a doctor, if you had a broken leg and all the doctor did was measure your blood pressure, you wouldn't get very far, right? You need to assess the right thing. And so when we're thinking about soil health assessment, we have to make sure that we look at enough of a broad spectrum of the various things that make up soil function that we can say, okay, yeah, you've got degraded soil, and some of your particular issues that you need to fix are X, Y, and Z. Various reasons for soil health assessment, right? One of them that, especially for growers, tends to be the most talked about is just to understand the constraints or the resource concerns beyond nutrient limitations. But there are some other reasons also. The next step is kind of, okay, once you understand your constraints, how do you specifically target management to alleviate those constraints, right? So assess what's going on. You've got a broken leg. Okay, what do we do about it? We reset the bone and we put it in a cast and wait for it to heal, right? That's kind of what we're doing with soils, right? They're majorly degraded, and we need to reset them. We need to invest in bringing their function back up, and then we need to kind of keep managing that, keep taking care of them for a while before they get to that point where you can really start to notice the difference. And we had some folks say yesterday, yeah, that might be 2, 3, 4 years. In some climates, it might be 5, 10 years. But that's the way that we're going to bring them back. And so we have to understand how to target those management practices to alleviate particular concerns. Also, of course, we can measure improvement over time. We can get an idea of what the impact is, how fast that change is happening. There's uses in research. It can help improve awareness, like in the case of the farm that I started with. when we did a soil health assessment and sat down with that farmer and said, look, you've been managing excellently on the chemical side because you've had that information. Here's new information for you. Look, your aggregate stability is low, your active carbon is low, your soils are really compacted, right? Suddenly there was concrete information where we could say, okay, here's a way that we can help you be aware of what the problems are with your soil and why it's not working as well and why you are having trouble with these crops that really need much better physical and biological soil function. Enabling farmland valuation is something that isn't being done currently much, but I think there's a lot of potential to use soil health assessments as a basis for saying, look, this is really valuable agricultural land because it has been very well managed, and look here, its soil health is at an excellent point. Assessment of farming risk, right? We've talked a lot about how soils that are not healthy are in much more of a risk kind of situation, and then it can enable policy recommendations. So lots of opportunities to use soil health assessments. So I want to go through a couple of techniques, a couple of tools that are out here. NRCS has something we call soil health resource concern, and what that is basically a set of defined existing or expected degradation items for soil, water, air, plants, animals, to the extent that the sustainability or intended use of that resource is impaired. And so for soil health, there is a compaction resource concern, right? Is the soil compacted or is it not? Is organic matter depleting? And then there are two that we added while I was directing that division, because we were training conservation planners to go out in the field and work with farmers on adopting these practices. But because of the way NRCS works, where you have to identify a resource concern before you can actually sign them up for EQIP practices and pay them for it, basically conservation planners didn't have a resource concern to point to with the right tools to say, look, this resource concern is there, therefore we need to sign up this farmer. And so we created two new resource concerns: soil organism habitat loss and degradation, and aggregate instability, to really help planners see it in the field, document it, and then sign up their producers for the right practices to alleviate those concerns, because these two were kind of getting us there, but the assessment tools in place really weren't doing the trick. So talked about this a bit, right? Soil health is kind of like taking the soil to the doctor, and we use indicators through that. So the two methods, you can do an in-field assessment that tends to be more qualitative or sometimes semi-quantitative. So you can kind of put numbers on it, but most of the time you're looking for is it there or is it not? Does it meet this threshold or does it not? By looking at the soil visually, by doing a few very simple tests that might just take a few minutes. And they're rapid, they're instant, right? You can start a conversation with the farmer right away as you're seeing something in the field. They're not, the in-field assessments aren't as good for monitoring over time, because you don't come out with a concrete number that is very replicatable, where 10 years later you can go back and say, okay, wow, it's much better now. Laboratory assessments are quantitative, right? You can come up with an actual number, and they're recently more available, and the longer term conversation with a farmer can be really helped by having that kind of assessment, because you can look at numbers, you can look at how they're changing over time. But you have to get a sample and send it to the lab and get your numbers back, which takes longer than for soil nutrient testing. But they're very useful tools. And at this point, actually, NRCS can provide financial assistance for soil testing 216. So there's actually ability to do that now. And the in-field assessment that we developed is one that is now part of conservation planning. It's integrated into the policy. All of our conservation planners at NRCS know that. And so you can contact your NRCS folks at the local county office or in the state office, and they'll be able to probably provide assistance on how to assess soil health in the field with this in-field assessment. So a field visit is critical, can't do it without. There's a farmer interview that's part of that cropland in-field assessment. You can use web soil survey to get an idea of sort of the inherent properties of the soil. And then as you go out in the field, there's various tools, right? There's the soil survey, there's having conversation with the farmer, but you probably want to bring out a shovel. maybe some knives, maybe a little bit of water and some sink strainers, so you can do that demonstration and assessment that we saw Doug Peterson do yesterday. You can bring out infiltration rings because it can be really enlightening to put an infiltration ring in some really compacted soil to see something much like the infiltration demo, the rainfall demo that Doug Peterson did on the table yesterday. You can effectively do that in the field by sticking a ring in the field in a spot that's degraded and then doing the same thing maybe in a grassy strip on a fence line or something like that. Take notes, bring a camera. If you're as fancy as having a Munsell color chart, that's great, but it's not necessary. You can do without. I don't know if everybody's familiar with soil survey, so I'm just going to put a quick plug in. You can search for web soil survey. NRCS has surveyed almost all of the acres in the nation and identified types of soils. And what that means is it gives you the inherent non-management influenced properties of the soil that relate to the parent material underneath, to the climate and how that has influenced soil formation, to the topography of the landscape, to the organisms that live there, whether it's under forest, etc. And so you can get a lot of information about sort of the inherent expectations for that soil, so that then you can better understand how management has influenced that soil. The in-field assessment starts with a farmer interview. You can actually download the assessment form. That link is right here, technical note 45006. And there's basically a chart like this that you can put on a clipboard. And I know you can't see all that, so I'm going to go through each of the indicators briefly. It's basically a yes, no. Does each of these indicators meet a threshold or does it not? So first indicator in that in-field assessment is adequate soil cover. You basically go through the field, survey across it, and you identify, is there greater than 75% cover after planting, or is there less than that? If there's less than 75%, it doesn't meet. And so that's an indicator that's basically in the red. That then gets used in a set of decision trees to come up with which resource concern is in place. So to do that, you might look at, for example, in this case, planting is happening and almost the entire soil is going to still be covered, versus right here on the right, you see that there's not that cover. Surface crusts. You can survey a field for the presence of surface crusts. And if there's evidence of surface crusts on less than 5% of the field, it's in pretty decent shape. You often have little spots where there might be a little bit of crusting. That's all right. It's good to notice. But if you've got more than that, if you've got a field that looks like this on the right, any fields that look like that, you see that kind of crusting, that kind of smoothing over at the surface. You pick up a little clod and it looks really dense at the top. Those are signs of surface crusting, and you don't want that to be the way that the field is across a lot of it. Ponding is best assessed right after a rain. And so because a lot of indicators you might assess not when it's right after a rain, this one's actually a better one to get from the farmer. You might, in an interview with them, say, so do you tend to notice ponding right after it rains, and how long does that last? And so if there's evidence of ponding 24 hours or less after a typical raining event, generally that's okay. Kind of depends on the soil type. If it lasts for more than 24 hours, that's considered to be an issue. Now I should say here, these were national indicators that were put together with national thresholds. And as you might imagine, some soils are more prone to some of these things than others. And so one of the things that states do is they look at that assessment and say, okay, for our soils in the states, do we need to adjust these thresholds? So if you get with NRCS in your states and the thresholds don't match up with what you see here, go with what the state says, because they get adapted at the state level to be more appropriate locally. Penetration resistance, or compaction of the soil. If you see this kind of plating parallel with the ground, that's a sign of there being issues, right? And we've talked about that. We've looked at a number of examples like that. You can use a penetrometer in the field. It's basically a metal shaft with a pressure gauge at the top. And you can push that into the soil. And as you do that, read off the pressure you're having to exert to make it into the soil. If you have to push too hard, that's a sign of too much compaction. You can also stick a shovel in the ground, and again, if you see this kind of plating, if you see roots that have funny bends like this radish right here, if you see roots where there's basically one root in the middle of a dense clod instead of what you see at the bottom left here, nice fibrous roots, that's a big difference, right? The one on the right with the knife there, that's a very compacted clod with just one root that doesn't actually have access to all the water and nutrients that's in that clod because the soil is so compacted, so that would be an issue. Visually determining aggregate stability, that's one where you'd want to carry some water out there. And there are a number of different tests, visual tests that are part of the in-field assessment, and you can basically pick one. There's the slake test, there's the strainer test, there's an aggregate stability test developed at the Jornada station in the Southwest, and they all basically kind of get at the same thing. And there are, again, thresholds determined for if too much of your soil mass just falls apart, if those aggregates don't hold up, that's a problem, right? And you really want them to hold up much better. And again, here's a way to look at it and guess at what you're probably going to see from your water stable aggregates, right? You really want that soil to be crumbly with plenty of pore space in between so that you get infiltration, so that when the raindrops hit, they're not taking all that apart, closing up all the pores so that you get runoff, right? And you can often see, just when you stick a shovel in the ground, the difference in both color and to what extent the soil looks crumbly and well aggregated. But you can then test that with these various tests. You saw the slump test when Doug Peterson presented that yesterday. And it's pretty vivid, right? I mean, you can really see the difference between these soils taken from spots that are near each other. And it can not only be very informative to the farmer to do that kind of test, but also you can use it in this infield assessment and kind of give it a threshold and say, okay, this really doesn't meet, you've got aggregate stability issues. And we see them all over, right? This is Western New York Crop Management Association consultant who, aptly noted that we feel that we have some soil health problems, right? And those are not not unique to New York. They are all across the country, and I bet some of you have seen some of them. Plant roots and biopores. You can really get a good picture of how the soil is functioning by digging up live roots and taking a look at how they're growing through the soil. If there's the presence of dark root channels or biopores left from previous plants, or if you can see earthworm channels, that's a good sign. If you're seeing that roots are stressed, right? If they're making strange bends like that, if there's single, often stubby roots inside of compacted clods, if you don't see any previous root channels, if there's not pores evident from earthworms, that tends to be a sign of a problem. And just to give you an example, right here on the right, there's these very dark root channels where basically there was a root in place and then a different root followed that after that one decomposed. And that often happens multiple times in soils that receive relatively little tillage. And you can really see that as you dig up those live roots and take a look at what they're following. Now, kind of fun, there's an app for that. The Jornada station, Jeff Herrick at ARS, developed an app as part of Land PKS, which is actually a broader global tool that was developed for USAID, but that is also being integrated for national use. And he basically integrated all of these indicators into that tool. And so you can actually go to this link, download that app, and try out the soil health module. And so if you're in the field, you can click through and provide all the information into that app, and it can store it. Okay, so that's in-field assessment. Now, laboratory assessment is quantitative. It's not instant. You can see some of those same things in the field. What we like to recommend, and what's also part of the soil health demonstration trials that USDA funds, is that you do both an in-field assessment while you're there for that instant conversation, but that you also take a sample to send to a lab for soil health analysis. And again, this is basically to get at that additional aspect of soils where we've never really looked at quantitatively the biological and physical constraints that soils have, and therefore they've been kind of ignored in management. We know for nutrients that if you're low in nitrogen, that's going to limit crop growth. Similarly, though, these biological and physical soil functions really limit crop growth and limit resiliency. So we developed soil health testing. I would say, in terms of development, we have some, and there's still a lot of need for further development, right? One of the things that's still very much being worked on is once you get that number back from the lab, what does that number mean for the soils and the climate? That's still in the works. So for example, the Cornell lab has developed indicator interpretations that are good for the Northeast, but they're still not interpretations integrated for other parts of the country. So Southeastern soils, a lot of the indicators tend to be lower. So for example, if you measure organic matter, Southeastern soils are going to have, in general, lower organic matter because it's warmer and more moist, and so you get more decomposition, so it's harder for the soils to hold on to as much organic matter. But at least you can actually put a quantitative number on it, and you can monitor it over time, and over the next couple of years we will have pretty good regional calibration for a lot of these indicators. Key things about lab assessments: they're standardized, they're picked to have scientific and agronomic relevance, so they are indicators specifically of those soil functions we've been talking about. They tend to represent diverse processes so that we can get that full picture of health of the soil and not miss anything. They are easy and inexpensive to measure in comparison to a lot of the research methods. They are more expensive than just a nutrient test. And so again, it's one of those places where it's a bit of an investment for a farmer to do that. And interpretations need to be accessible to the public and are becoming more so. Luckily now NRCS can actually provide financial assistance for soil testing. The regional calibration is going to be iterative, but it's getting there. There is a technical note online, and I have a link here in the slides to that. That's basically the technical note where a large team across multiple organizations kind of evaluated all the different research measures that are soil health indicators, and that team came to some level of consensus of the best current available standard operating procedures for measuring those items in the lab. Now, there's still discussion. Not everybody will agree. It's still in some ways contentious because, of course, everybody wants their particular method to be the one that everybody picks, right? But there's some decent consensus that these are good indicators, and the 216 methods allow for some flexibility and are going to build in interpretations for multiple of these standard operating procedures so that it can be flexible, but so that a national data set can be built so that the interpretations can improve over time. So some lab indicators, those that are part of the 216 package. Aggregate stability is a big piece of it, and you'll see under each of these there's a couple of word description of what functional processes in the soil is relevant for. So aggregate stability, we've talked about how it's relevant to infiltration and to available water holding capacity, also erosion. Soil organic carbon or organic matter is something that has been measured for some time, not always with a standard method. And it's a very relevant indicator. It changes more slowly over time than some of the others, but it's a really important measure to get. And at least it's one that more farmers tend to have a little bit of back history on, so that's helpful. So carbon cycling, carbon sequestration, general function of the soil. There is a active carbon indicator that uses a particular procedure to extract a particular fraction of the organic matter that tends to be associated with sort of organism food source and organisms getting what they need. Short-term carbon mineralization or respiration, or basically breathing. It measures what our microbes are breathing. So it's a measure of CO2 over time and shows us how active those organisms are in the soil. And then there's an extractable protein measure. And if you think about proteins, basically it's where most of the nitrogen is, right? I mean, we all need protein, and plants need nitrogen and then therefore make proteins, and proteins are where most of the nitrogen that is tied up in organic matter is in soils. And so that is indicative of kind of a stable nitrogen pool in the soil that can become available over time. So those are the indicators that are currently part of these more comprehensive measures. And then there's compaction as one that you measure in the field, but that you can put a number on. And again, indicator interpretations by soil type based scoring functions is really important. They're being developed, but just as an example, in a Georgia Altasol, 2% organic matter would be considered pretty good. But 2% organic matter in the Iowa mollisol would be abysmally poor. You definitely got to take that soil to the doctor, right? So that's kind of the difference in terms of where you go regionally and interpreting those functions. I don't know if you can all see this, but this is a page from the Cornell Soil Health Manual. If you want to learn more about sort of how to specifically address constraints with management, there's a lot of good discussion in that, but any of the soil health test reports that get sent back for these come with short-term management suggestions and long-term management suggestions that can help address each of these indicators when they're constrained. And so you can then take a look at those, match those up with the particular practices that a grower might be able to implement, and adjust those to the production system to get at how to fix those constraints once they're identified. And just a brief example, one farm I worked on, they had this nice little pond that early on the left here was extremely eutrophied. And the interesting thing was that actually the soil above that pond was low in phosphorus, but it was so compacted that grazing animals, continuously grazed animals on that slope above that pond, on that very compacted soil, basically the manure didn't go into the soil was still low phosphorus, but it ran right off into the pond, causing this kind of eutrophication. So we had poor water quality and poor soil health. And we worked with that farm on a soil health management plan, ended up breaking up that compaction manually, but then interseeding additional deep-rooted crops with good taproots, and adding some lime because it was low in pH, and just kind of generally putting in a little bit of an investment to get it to grow better. Ended up getting really good crops established. Clovers started to come back once the pH was at a place where clovers can do better. And by a couple of years later, that pond was totally cleared up and was able to be used for recreational use again. So those are the kinds of examples that are possible, right? The approach being we need to train farmers and get them to be aware of why soil health matters, and then assess where their soil is at to help them understand what the constraints are. Plan on management that addresses those constraints. Implement that management in a way that works for that farm, and then observe what the changes are and possibly start over again, right? Continue the cycle. You might have to adjust some of the management over time to continue improvement, but we can really make a lot of positive impact there. So I will end there and leave a bit of time for any questions, anything that you're having aha moments about, anything that's confusing. Did this all make sense? How do you think you might integrate any of this into your action plans? Key messages that remain with you that might work with your producers and landowners that you work with?
I'll kick it off with one question, which is, you talked about Cornell. Are there many different places that do these lab assessments? Like, how do you, Cornell is one of them. Is Cornell the only one? Are there others?
There are starting to be more. And when I left USDA, we were at a point where we were trying to compile a list of all the labs who had partial or all of these indicators covered. But federal government has a hard time publishing something that points to commercial sources of something. And so last I heard is that there was finally approval to actually publish that list. I don't know that that has happened yet. There are other labs, and there are increasingly more labs that are picking up measuring these indicators. I don't know what the reporting formats are for other labs right now, nor which labs in the Southeast provide that. But now that you say that, I'm thinking that that's probably a follow-up for me to contact folks and say, hey, did that list ever come out? Is it coming? What are the appropriate sources in the Southeast? Where are those indicator interpretations at?
Great.
I can say just when I was living in Louisiana, we would send off our soil, just like our backyard garden soil, to the LSU Ag Center, and they would do those tests. So it wouldn't surprise me if other land grant universities in the Southeast had that capability too.
Nice.
Other thoughts, questions? Don't be shy.
Yeah, in North Carolina, NC State has a soil program, and they actually do it. They do like the basic soil testing for free, April through November, I think. So like during the height of the season, but if you get it in before then or during that time, they'll send off like the basic soil samples, the basic soil information for free, which is pretty great.
Yeah. Do they do any soil health testing yet?
Sorry?
Do they do any soil health testing yet?
I'm not sure. That you might have to pay for that. They do like the basic, you need to lime this, this is how much, you know, this is your NPK numbers and things like that. But they might do some other fun stuff. You just have to pay for it.
Is it something, Bianca, that it typically, do you have a sense of what the sort of average cost is for a lab assessment?
Couldn't tell you what the average cost is,
Right.
because I don't really know who else is out there
Who
providing
else doing
what.
it? Right, right.
But I know that the Cornell test was somewhere a bit over $100, and I don't know where that's at. So it's definitely much more steep than your $10 or $15 soil nutrient test. The
Right.
idea is you would do it up front as an investment, and then maybe 3 to 5 years later you come back and do it again. It's not the kind of thing where you have to do a test for every single field or every single management unit, because management tends to be more sort of whole field based. Often you can get a lot of information from testing your worst field and 1 or 2 in between and your very best field, and getting an idea of where those lay.
I'm curious whether people would imagine doing any kind of in-field assessment along with a farmer or a landowner, or whether you would imagine that it's far more likely that you would just suggest that that is something that a farmer or a landowner do. Curious on that front. Anybody have thoughts there?
I don't know if I would, at this point, want to do it with the farmer, but I'm responsible for writing baseline documentation reports, and I think it might be interesting to like practice doing field assessments as part of that, and I don't know, maybe building up some confidence before doing it with the farmer. But I think I'm really interested by the idea of having some of these simpler tests to do in-house that would get quick results, and I'm interested by it.
Yeah, I think the idea of baseline testing is a great one, right? When you get a new property under easement, having an idea of where it's at that point, getting some of that baseline data would be really helpful. And just so you all know, we do have some funding in our FRPP grant that's funding this for soil health assessment type stuff. And so we can provide some services. I'm in the process of hiring a couple of people who can be more available to answer questions about that kind of thing. And there's some funding to, for example, pay for a few soil health tests or get some soil health kit equipment like sink strainers and tubes to do the demo in and that kind of stuff. So that's something that just want to put out there, as it's something that we're figuring out how to best use those funds. But if you see a good opportunity where you will use that kind of thing a lot, we want to know about it, and we'll put that in the hopper as we figure out how to best roll out those funds.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to have a tool to be able to start that conversation on the property with the landowner, and then refer them to that more holistic test.
Right.
But to not providing them with information on their soil with concrete, like, do better, but just as a starting point for that for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Annie, that's a really good point, because again, sort of where is, I think for many of us in the land protection world, it's sort of where is that starting point? Where is that sort of invitation to engage around soil health, particularly on a property that may have been protected decades ago, might be a new owner, but it's still sort of, okay, how do you begin this conversation and being able to say, you know, we could just do a little sort of in-field assessment here that would give you a little bit of a sense of it, just sort of FYI, right? As just a way to start that conversation.
And I think having a tool like that shovel with the pressure gauge or something like that, where it's not my opinion that I'm offering, but it's a number and it's, look, this is what this tool is showing us. I think that helps. That would boost my personal confidence and even starting that conversation with them.
Makes sense.
Right.
I know as a former cattle farmer, I would love to have had one of those pressure tools to see how my pastures were doing. I've still got a farm that I'm an absentee landlord of, and it's like I need to have a talk with my tenant, or change my agreement, because I need to test that farm. And we have, like say, we have farms within our program here in Lexington that lots to assess, and we got a lot of horse pasture. I wonder how compacted that is. We're all seeing more and more runoff from big rains, and the more we can do about them, helping our streams and creeks, if that's all we help, that's a great big step.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely. And, just one little snippet of perspective, if you take a, 1/8 inch pour and you squish it down to being a lot, being half that size, the water flowing through it is going to be 1/16 the rate. So huge impact for water flow speed as you lose those large pores. The larger pores that you have that are open at the surface and have some level of continuity down into the profile, the more you're going to be able to infiltrate that water fast when you get those downpours and really get it distributed throughout the soil profile so it can be stored for when you don't have that rain.